They say that in the Tower of London, when the wind blows in from the river, you can still hear an echo, the echo of a head falling on wood. A head with the face of a woman. Who was that woman, and what had she done to deserve such a macabre end? She was Anne Boleyn. And to understand her end, we must first return to the beginning. If you're ready to open the door to a story woven with blood and ambition, subscribe, turn on the bell, and leave a like, because what you're about to hear is not a fairy tale. England. 16th century. The air smelled of incense, damp ancient stone, and secrets. The Tudor court gleamed with golden brocades, endless feasts, and whispered conspiracies behind the tapestries. There, among obedient blue-blooded women, born to bow and remain silent, she appeared, Anne Boleyn. She wore no crown, had no inherited castles. She was the daughter of a shrewd diplomat and an ambitious lady-in-waiting. But in her eyes shone something that lineage could never offer: willpower. A sharp, almost insolent gaze, and a tongue as sharp as a dagger hidden in silk. As a child, she was sent to the continent, first to the Netherlands, then to France. There, among the intoxicating perfumes of Queen Claude's court and the libertine whispers of the Renaissance, she learned to survive without asking permission. She learned to speak French like a courtesan, to read the classics like a humanist, to dance like a queen. But most of all, she learned to observe, to measure silences, to sharpen words, to control her presence like someone who commands a storm. And was not the most beautiful in the room, but wherever she entered, the air changed. When she returned to England, her fate seemed already written, a life behind the curtains, on the margins of power, as lady-in-waiting to Queen Catherine of Aragon. But destiny, when it finds a woman hungry for history, trembles. Henry saw her, and with a single glance, the world split in two. Henry was an imposing king. He stood over 6 feet tall, with a robust build, broad shoulders, and reddish hair that glowed in the sun. He had a deep, powerful voice that filled any room, a contagious laugh, and a presence that overwhelmed everything. He loved hunting, wine, and banquets. But more than anything, he loved to be adored, and feared nothing more than dying without a male heir. When he saw Anne for the first time, it wasn't love at first sight. It was a challenge. A woman who didn't lower her gaze, who didn't laugh at his jokes, who didn't tremble before his title. Anne was different. Her skin was slightly sun-kissed from France, her dark eyes sparkled with irony, and her posture was proud, almost theatrical. Henry looked at her once, and couldn't stop. Anne wasn't the most beautiful, but she had something he had never faced before, a woman who didn't bow. While others ran to please him, and pulled away, returned his gifts, excused herself from dances, spoke to him in French, and silenced him with a single look. The king, accustomed to watching the world kneel, found himself before a wall he couldn't break. And that obsessed him. But Henry was not a free man. His wife, Catherine, had been at his side for nearly 2 decades. But she could no longer give him a son, only a daughter, Mary. And in the king's eyes that wasn't enough, and was the promise of an heir. But she refused to be another Mary Boleyn, her own sister, who had been the king's mistress and discarded like a used handkerchief. And didn't want his bed. She wanted his throne. And so, Henry stepped into the madness of politics. He asked the Pope for an annulment, claimed the marriage was invalid because Catherine had been his brother's widow. But Rome refused. Behind Catherine stood the Catholic monarchs of Spain, and humiliating her would offend an entire continent. Henry erupted in fury. And Anne, her voice laced with velvet and poison, whispered to him, "Why do you need the Pope, if you are the voice of God in England?" That's when Henry crossed into the unthinkable. He would break with Rome, with the Pope, with the Church itself. He declared his marriage to Catherine null and void, without Vatican approval, and created his own church, the Church of England, with himself as supreme head, judge, shepherd, and executioner. Catherine was stripped of her title, banished to distant castles, where the damp soaked into her bones and the servants obeyed in fear. Her daughter Mary was disinherited, pushed into the shadows, as if she had never been a princess. And then, in secret, Henry married Anne Boleyn. Not in a grand cathedral, but in a discreet ceremony, sealed more by desire than faith. Boleyn was at the top. The woman for whom Henry had torn down his kingdom, defied Rome, burned his bridges with Europe. She was pregnant. The realm held its breath. Everyone expected a boy. But in September 1533, a girl was born, a little one with reddish hair and inquisitive eyes. Elizabeth. The king hid his disappointment and held her tightly, as if to shield her from the world. But the wind had already changed, and became pregnant again, and lost the baby. And again. And again. Miscarriages. Blood. Silence. In January 1536, and lost another child, said to be a boy. Hope bled away with each loss. That same month, Catherine of Aragon died. Some said and celebrated in yellow. Others said it was a scream of despair. But one thing was certain, she had no one left to blame. And the king no longer looked at her the same. Henry had been eclipsed by Jane Seymour, docile, quiet, virginal. Everything and was not. The king smiled again. And then began to tremble. She had defeated a queen, challenged the pope, shaken the world, but the throne slipped through her fingers. Power does not forgive, and the palace smelled of betrayal. Rumors came like a plague, and was accused of adultery, with 5 men, including her own brother, George Boleyn. Incest. Treason. Conspiracy. The evidence was weak. Testimonies contradictory. Dates impossible. But no one cared. Henry needed blood. And Anne once more became his obsession, but now, as an enemy. She was taken to the Tower of London, the same tower she had entered as queen. Now, she entered as a prisoner. During her trial, she defended herself, denied everything, wept for her daughter Elizabeth, cried out for justice. But she was already condemned. Guilty. May 19, 1536. At dawn, Anne Boleyn was led to the scaffold. She wore dark grey, a crimson cloak, a simple headdress. The executioner, a French swordsman brought specially to avoid mistakes, and knelt. The breeze lifted her cloak. Silence fell like a tomb. She said, "I have come here not to accuse anyone, but to die. And I ask you to pray for me." The sword fell. Swift. Precise. And with it an era fell. That same day, Henry became engaged to Jane Seymour. 3 days later they married, and was buried without ceremony beneath the cold floor of St. Peter ad Vincula Chapel. No royal tomb. No epitaph. But that wasn't the end. Somewhere in the palace, a 2-year-old girl named Elizabeth played, unaware her mother no longer existed. That girl, ignored and orphaned, daughter of the fallen, would one day make the whole continent tremble. Because Anne Boleyn's legacy was not her tragic death, it was her daughter. And that daughter, Elizabeth I, would become the most legendary queen in England's history, and was forgotten by the man who destroyed a kingdom for her. But history did not forget her. Because her blood, her defiance, her fire, gave birth to an empire. If this story shook you, subscribe to the channel, activate the bell, and leave a like. Thank you for watching until the end, and remember, always walk toward the light, even when history is written in shadows.